First of all, thank you to all of you for the incredibly hospitable welcome here this evening. It's a pleasure to see everyone. Thank you, Telly, for your generous introduction. George and Telly for the invitation to be here this evening. Thank you, President Teplo, for joining us and for being with us here this evening. Thank you especially to Chris and Anastasia, Economos, and also your family for the vision to establish this lecture. Your Grace, Bishop Irene, Father, thank you for being here this evening. It's really a pleasure and a privilege also to see so many friends who we haven't seen each other because of COVID for so long. I really, when I was invited by George and Telly to speak this evening, I was especially moved by virtue of the fact that this is the 10-year milestone moment in the center's lifespan here at Fordham. And I'm also acutely aware of the fact that I have both a responsibility and face a challenge at being the first, I think, and until now the only political scientist to join the universe of Economos speakers. So I hope that I will live up to that challenge and leave you with some food for thought. By way of beginning, and I'm going to turn on my clock here so that I know how much time I'm using. By way of beginning, I want to start with a confession of sorts. In the time ensuing between my writing of the abstract for this evening's lecture several months ago and my standing before you now, Russia's war in Ukraine has entered its 9th month. And so my text has gone through innumerable starts and restarts, revisions and redirections. And I've really wrestled with tonight's lecture. The length, the scope, and the consequences of the war in Ukraine have broadened and deepened. The human cost in terms of lives lost, peoples displaced, have multiplied. Political leaders from Moscow to Brussels to Kyiv to Washington have resorted with increasing frequency to reckless and cavalier statements about nuclearity and nuclear war. And those have been reiterated in the discursive echo chamber of profit-driven, algorithm-powered media. And the Orthodox world has been driven into a fractiousness that aggravates the divisions in Christianity writ large. So as I wrote my text, all of these things came to mind. All of these realities have really made me wrestle with how to approach my promised topic of deconstructing Russia's Ukraine war, religion, power, and the geopolitics of Orthodox Christianity. So I'm going to approach the deconstruction of the war in Ukraine in 3 parts. 2 related to conceptual architecture, 1 related to analysis. First, I'd like to offer a brief note on the theoretical and conceptual terminology that's shaping political science research on the nexus between geopolitics and religion. I want to suggest here how what I call religious geopolitics and the geopolitics of religion are both active features that can help us understand the Ukraine war. Second, I want to offer a very short introduction to the typology of power that has emerged in political science literature and diplomatic practice over the past several decades. And here I want to suggest how different types of power, hard, soft, sharp, and smart, are informed into the operation of both religious geopolitics and the geopolitics of religion. And then third, I'd like to offer an abbreviated general application of these 2 categories, the geopolitics of religion and the religious geopolitics, to deconstruct Russia's war in Ukraine. And what I'd like to suggest here is that key stakeholders in the war view this religion geopolitics nexus in terms of their own calculations of power, their own power resources and tools that will allow them to accomplish their objectives that are related to the war. My modest goal this evening in our brief time together is to persuade you, make a persuasive argument that deconstructing Russia's war in Ukraine underscores the need for continuing research into the geopolitics-religion nexus. Geopolitics and religion need to speak to one another, and also need for continuing research into the meaning and the application of power, and how both religious and secular religions and states actually apprehend and deploy power, And then finally, to convince you of something I think you already know, the need for Orthodox Christianity to figure prominently and richly in a research agenda at the interstices of religion and geopolitics. So let me turn to part one, a note on terminology. Okay. Charles Clover, who served as Moscow bureau chief for the Financial Times from 2008 to 2013, pithily opined about geopolitics that, quote, few modern ideologies are as whimsically all-encompassing, as romantically obscure, as intellectually sloppy, and as likely to start a third world war. Clover's words came to mind in 2016, when I was in Crete for the Holy and Great Council. I was honored to be one of only a few women who were on the delegations at the council. And in response to my comment that the absence of 4 Orthodox churches from the council could only be fully understood in terms of geopolitics, my good friends, colleagues, all theologians laboring in the Ecumenical Patriarchate's press office at the council immediately followed their assenting nods to my comment by a puzzled query. Well, what do you mean by geopolitics? Now, of course, since that time, it's become almost a commonplace, I think, among theologians and religious studies scholars, and certainly among social scientists, diplomats, and media commentators, to discuss Russia's war in Ukraine in terms of geopolitics, both great power and religious, and in particular, Orthodox Christian. But the almost ubiquitous mainstreaming of the religion geopolitics nexus in discussions about the Ukraine war has not gone a long way to helping to contribute to either state or ecclesiastical peacemaking. And this speaks not only to the messiness of the term geopolitics, but also to the broadness of the category of religion, which leaves us with what Tristan Sturm neatly sums up as the still, quote, relatively inchoate field of the study on religion and geopolitics. So let me try to reduce the opacity of the geopolitics-religion nexus. Geopolitics as a concept originates long before Swedish political scientist, geographer, and politician Rudolf Kellen's 1899 neologism. After all, Herodotus was writing as far back as the 5th century BC about the relationship between geography and politics, geopolitics. And geographers, historians, political scientists, diplomats were very intensively problematizing the term geopolitics and the meaning of it in the period of state formation that was being crystallized in the 17th century treaties of Westphalia. Indeed, geopolitics as the study of how geography is implicated in politics, and especially in the political relationships between and among states, has been inextricably linked to the consolidation of territorialized, sovereign Westphalian states. Not surprisingly then, the genealogy of geopolitics originates with a primary focus on the physical territory, the physical geography of the state, and a focus on the projection of force necessary to protect territorial borders and to control maritime, land routes, and now space, and to monopolize the economic resources necessary for state durability. The evolution in the genealogy of geopolitics to a conception of geography that moves beyond physical territoriality, and one that incorporates culture and identity, also has deep roots. But it's really been the focus of a more recent phenomenon, what's called the critical turn in geopolitics. And accordingly, the state has been understood like a species nourished by the ecological niche that it occupied. The critical school of geopolitics understands geography in terms of race, language, ethnicity, and has deployed those categories to support arguments and policies related to state prerogatives in power projection, and to support arguments about nationalism and international relations. And I thought instructive in this regard in terms of the roots of the integration of both territorial and identity conceptions of geography was something called the Universal Races Congress, which was held in London in the early 20th century, and whose executive committee convened London-based anthropologists, politicians, businessmen, historians, colonial administrators, linguists, and magistrates to find ways, and here I quote historian and legal scholar Helen Tilley, to find ways to combat the logically untenable supposition prevalent amongst many states and peoples about the superiority of certain races of mankind, their superiority in their customs, their civilization, and their race over others. So there was a recognition as early as the start, before that, but at the start of the 20th century, that geography, a pluriform understanding of geography, in both terms of physical territory, but also identity geography, could lead to very ugly outcomes, but also might hold the possibilities for peace, locally, regionally, and internationally. Now, this expanded category of geopolitics to a pluriform conception of geographies has two important implications for religion. First, geopolitical theorists and practitioners largely adopted the assumptions of secularization theory for a long time, which meant an attendant lack of interest in the salience of religion for geography and politics. But second, and more recently, there's been a religious turn in theorizing and practice of geopolitics, primarily because religion is category disturbing for geopolitics, in Elizabeth Maddox's formulation. Religion disrupts geopolitics by reminding global practitioners of the incongruities between a world wherein religious ideas, actors, and practices are not neatly configured according to either the physical or the identity geographies wholly determined by states. And I would add here that geopolitics has been equally category disrupting for religion, because geopolitics reminds religions that the transnational liminal worldviews and organizations of faith communities are disrupted and continue to be disrupted by the territorialization of the world into the unit of the state. So at the core of the relationship between geopolitics and religion, and I'll wrap up this first part, is the state-religion relationship. And I would have us consider that that state-religion relationship is really an iterative competition for conceptualizing, organizing, and dominating the interaction of geographies and politics. Now, this leads me to my two distinct categories when it comes to the religion-geopolitics nexus. The first is religious geopolitics, and that refers to states as primary actors who are seeking either to use or to marginalize theologically inspired worldviews and or religious institutions and organizational capacity, and here I mean leaders, networks, norms, regimes, for purposes of state control over both physical geography, territorial geography, and symbolic identity geography, what we oftentimes think of as the nation, but beyond that. So, accordingly, religious geopolitics views geography primarily in non-religious terms because it's a way of conceiving of the world and of practicing that is state-centric. Religion either should be marginalized or instrumentalized for state prerogatives and objectives. The second concept, the geopolitics of religion, refers to religions as primary actors who are committed to their theologically grounded worldviews, practices, and truth claims that both transcend those of states and other religious competitors. So the geopolitics of religion conceives of geographies as the locus of competition for truth claims, diverse truth claims, both religious and secular. And also conceives of geopolitics as the locus of competition for hegemony of interpretation and authority within religious traditions. So this takes on a religion-state dimension, but also an internal religion dimension. Now, there is a quality of messiness, admittedly, about these distinctions, but I hope to show that they are useful. And I want to turn, with that in mind, to a short introduction, very brief introduction to the concept of power, because it's power that elucidates both the practice of religious geopolitics and the geopolitics of religion. Oh, there's a clock right up there. Okay. So, what is power? It's a concept that's ancient and ubiquitous. It cuts across intellectual disciplines, and it's intuitively grasped by individuals and groups alike as relational. Power is relational. But even so, Yale political theorist and champion of democracy, the late Robert Dahl, observed in 1957 that there are great challenges in producing a single, coherent, consistent theory of power. And renowned Harvard Kennedy School political scientist Joseph Nye, observed in 60 decades later, in 2005, that power is like the weather. Everyone depends on it and talks about it, but few understand it. He said, power is also like love. It's easier to experience than to define or measure, but no less real for that. Where there is consensus on the meaning of power is in the following definition. Power is the ability to affect others to obtain the outcomes that you want. Or, power is the ability to influence another to act in ways in which that entity would not have acted otherwise. That's power. Now, Nye and others since the latter part of the 20th century have classified 4 types of power. I mentioned them at the outset: hard, soft, sharp, and smart. And the nature of these 4 types of power has consequences for our aim of deconstructing the war in Russia. Okay, and for using concrete tools and strategies to influence the behaviors of others. Let me introduce very briefly the key features of these 4 types of power. Hard power is power that's coercive. It entails the ability of states and non-state actors alike to coerce through action, threats, intimidation, inducement, payments, in order to get others to behave as you would like. The primary resources of hard power are material, namely force and economics. Soft power is persuasive, it's attractive, co-optive, and it entails getting others to want the outcomes that you want by shaping the preferences of others. The primary resources of soft power are ideational, or according to Nye, who introduced this category, the primary resources of soft power are culture and values. Sharp power is a more recent category developed by social scientists to describe power whose nature is manipulative and distractive, as opposed to coercive or persuasive. And it's sharp because it pierces, penetrates, or perforates the political and information environments in targeted countries, or in our case, targeted countries, states, and targeted religions. The resources of sharp power are overwhelmingly technological. And this should resonate. All we have to do is watch the news every night. Regardless of what are your news stations, sharp power, or whatever your favorite blog sites or your favorite information platforms, that's sharp power. We're being exposed to sharp power, okay? And sharp power actually was a term that then led to the final term, smart power, which, not surprisingly, incorporates a mix of all 3 of these other types of power. And it was actually in 2009, before sharp power was discussed, that then Secretary of State, or about to be confirmed Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, used the term smart power in her confirmation hearings, and said that smart power combines elements of hard and soft, and I would add sharp power, in ways that are mutually reinforcing. So, now, turning to part 3, how do these different types of power help to understand religious geopolitics and the geopolitics of religion as applied to Russia's war in Ukraine? We have a conceptual architecture, now let's do a little bit of analysis. Over the last 9 months, the war in Ukraine has become the largest conflict since the Korean War, measured in terms of battlefield deaths, personnel committed, and ordnance used. And that's not only in terms of those inside Ukraine. This includes all participants in the war, Ukrainians, Russians, and others. And it's also become the world's largest human displacement crisis, with an estimated 1/3 of Ukrainians forced from their homes. Academic policy and practitioner interest in the salience of religion in Ukraine has ebbed and flowed over the course of the conflict, but it's focused on three main subject areas: the partnership between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Patriarch of Moscow, Kirill Budayev, as responsible for the collaboration between the Kremlin and the Russian Orthodox Church; inter-Orthodox relations and the Ukraine question as ecclesiastical conflict and ecumenical complication, and that's related to the disagreement over the legitimacy and consequences of the Tomos of Autocephaly that was issued by the Ecumenical Patriarchate for the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And then finally, there's been a focus on theological judgments about whether the Russian world, Ruski Mir philosophy, is heretical or not. Indeed, the Orthodox Christian Studies Center's own Public Orthodoxy blog has been a very lively editorial forum hosting commentary around all three of these general topics. I would say that the categories of religious geopolitics and geopolitics of religion help to expand in and beyond some of these three main themes. And if we consider the calculations and applications of power, we may enhance the possibilities of something that I think everyone here, all faith traditions in America, are and hopefully are committed to, which is namely producing a durable peace. So let me answer three questions with regard to with regard to religious geopolitics and the geopolitics of religion in terms of the war in Ukraine. The three questions are as follows: who are the main competitors, stakeholders of the conflict, allies and enemies? Are they states or religion? Second, what does geography mean? Is it understood in physical territory or identity territory for the main stakeholders? And third, how do the stakeholders assess their power resources, and in what capacity and context do they deploy the resources? And again, this is going to be a very general, broad deconstruction and response to each of these three questions with regard to religious geopolitics and then geopolitics of religion. So for religious geopolitics, who are the main competitors? The main competitors are combatants or states. We know that the international system remains organized according to the unit of the state, despite the reality of non-state actors as key players. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 therefore contravened the foundational principles of the international order, namely the inviolability of state borders and respect for the sovereignty of the state, defined in terms that I discussed earlier. The internationalization of the Ukraine conflict has occurred, again, within the parameters of this Westphalian system. And states, either actively or passively, directly or indirectly, are the main competitors and combatants in the war in Ukraine. And notwithstanding intense disputes about the origins of the war, whether it's the result of Russian revisionism or whether it's provoked by NATO expansionism, and there's a whole host of very, very serious public intellectuals and scholars who stand on either side of this and meet sometimes in the middle. From the perspective of religious geopolitics, the major actors are states, multilateral alliances, and international organizations. Where religion is considered, it's a second-order factor to the priorities of these state actors. So what does geography mean, and where does religion fit? The dominant understanding of geography in religious geopolitics is the state, the physical territory, and the boundaries and borders of the state. So control over the geography of land, maritime routes, and air control is what's at stake among state combatants. Having said that, religion does come into play in terms of the calculations of states. And all we need to do is look at the flood of statements by Putin and the Kremlin's cadre of state ideologues and intellectuals who've expressed an inextricable organic linkage between the physical territory of Ukraine and the Russian world that's heavily centered on religion. This religious geopolitics relativizes the borders among Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, and it's been used as the justification for Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, and since February 2022 for the invasion. And the argument of orthodoxy in the Russian language as the taproot of a single people in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus has been adopted by the Kremlin, and it's made the Kremlin's invasion of Ukraine into a putative move to protect the unity and secure Russia's sphere of influence, understood in terms of physical and ideational geography. Now, it's important to point out that the Ruski Mir concept, sometimes overstated, other times underappreciated, it predates Putin's ascension to power, but it was he who introduced it into political discourse and mainstreamed it into in public conversation. And this is where we see states beginning to adopt and utilize and instrumentalize cultural and religious arguments in terms of prosecuting the war. The partnership between Putin and Patriarch Kirill has made, therefore, religion a centerpiece of the Ruski Mir concept in ways that take into account state actors outside of the region and their own real or perceived use of religion for purposes of territorial control over Ukraine and threat to Russia. This is the perspective from Moscow. The insinuation and expression of religion into the physical geography of the Ukraine war has also been a feature of state actions by Kyiv, Washington, and to some extent Brussels, but with different valences. The narrative in these capitals has articulated Ukraine's territory as the physical expression of an ideational geography, a sacred ideational geography, the rules-based international order that is theoretically under siege for the first time since the Second World War. And in this regard, then, these states see Ukraine as the territorial incarnation of Western values, norms, and rules about the inviolability of sovereignty. Also, the war in Ukraine, in the language of these states who appropriate religion and deploy religion and identities, these states argue that the war in Ukraine is a global cosmic battle between the forces of Western universal values and norms of freedom and democracy versus Eastern particularist values and norms of unfreedom and autocracy. Notice that this is the same language that's used by Moscow. So there's a reflexivity and a mirroring that's going on here, where states are using very similar discourses for very oppositional ambitions. Now, the visits and comments of U.S. diplomats, from former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and U.S. Ambassador-at-Large Samuel Brownback, and former U.S. Ambassador to Greece Jeffrey Pyatt, reinforced this civilizational discourse. And it's rooted in Sam Huntington's 1993 Clash of Civilization argument, where he identified Ukraine as a torn state in which Russian Orthodoxy was opposed to Western values and norms, and therefore responsible for the internal tearing. So even in religious geopolitics, which is focused overwhelmingly on control of physical territory, we see religion making its way into the ways in which states articulate, justify, and prosecute the war. Now, in terms of hard, soft, sharp, and smart power resources, very quickly. I would say, first of all, power is at the center of Russia's war in Ukraine and the deployment of hard power resources, military material, manpower, intelligence, and economic assistance and humanitarian support, along with sanctions, is the centerpiece of the power toolbox for religious geopolitical practitioners. But there has also been the use of smart power. And here I refer to what I mentioned recently, just moments ago, the introduction of religion, norms, and values into the toolbox, the power toolbox of those who are prosecuting the war in Ukraine. And we see that there has been a deployment of soft power resources in a globalized network where Russia, Ukraine, and others compete in bilateral and multilateral contexts, in alliance contexts, in intergovernmental contexts, and also in interreligious contexts, in order to try to win the hearts and minds of those who stand on one or the other side of the war. And these are the contexts in which political scientists like Kristina Mikolova and Michael Simetka, sociologist Christine Stokel, have analyzed the use of soft power in terms of norms entrepreneurship and norms protagonism. In terms of sharp power in religious geopolitics, there's ample evidence that religion has become an important part of the power repertoire that's used in terms of manipulation and redirection. There's not enough time for me to go into more detail on that, but I'd be happy to do it. But one of the things that's very important is that in terms of states and the way they're using sharp power, and we can see this very, very explicitly when it comes to Russia, the use of information networks and online platforms to manipulate content, to manipulate arguments, and to present a set of images to support and validate the invasion of Ukraine has been matched by competing sharp power information networks and platforms that are used by those who push back against what Russia is doing, and also that are constructing a particular image of Ukraine, what's happening in Ukraine, and where Ukraine figures in this interstate competition about spheres of influence in Europe and Eurasia. Let me turn now to the geopolitics of religion to answer each of these questions. And incidentally, I won't say anything about smart power for either of these categories because it's beyond the time here, but also my capacity to measure the efficacy of the combination of these resources. But I would submit that the efficacy of all of these resources, regardless of what perspective one adopts, geopolitics of religion or religious soft power, don't equate to being smart, because the enormous loss of life, the extraordinary destruction of physical infrastructure, the vilification and villainization, the essentialization of peoples in civilizational discourse, and the discussion about nuclear war that can annihilate the world, to me, in no way fits under the term smart. So, let me go now quickly to answer the questions with the geopolitics of religion. Who are the main competitors? The dominant competitors are religious actors, primarily the 15 Orthodox churches that comprise the global Orthodox Church, and I use the number 15 to include the 14 Orthodox churches who were intended to participate in Crete, plus the newly recognized since 2019 Autocephalous Orthodox Church of Ukraine. I would also add other religions into the stakeholder mix in the war in Ukraine: the Greek Catholic Church, the Jewish communities, the Muslim communities. And I emphasize all of these because the remarkable pluralism of Ukraine's religious ecosystem has been thrown into sharp relief by the war. It's been widely described, analyzed by social scientists. The sociologist of religion, Jose Casanova, calls this pluralism incipient denominationalism. But what we see in terms of the geopolitics of religion and this incredibly pluralized religious ecosystem in Ukraine is that religious communities understand the geography of Ukraine in terms of their own religious composition and their competition and the diversity of theological worldviews that are active in the politics of that territory, of that geography. So the war in Ukraine has helped to clarify where these different religious communities sit vis-a-vis one another, how they see each other in terms of their own internal religious diversity, and also how they engage with states. And I would say that the military conflict has highlighted the active involvement of faith leaders who use their theological worldviews, practices, and truth claims, as well as their own institutional ambitions and interests, to articulate their positions on the war. Here I quote former U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry. He opined in a 2013 address on human rights and international religious freedom. He said, "Where people of all faiths are mingling like never before, where we are a global community, those concerned with human rights, justice, and peace ignore religion at our peril." And so in terms of the geopolitics of religion, we ignore it at our peril if we're concerned with finding a solution to the war in Ukraine and all that it entails. Now, it bears mention that before the outbreak of the 2022 war, the fragmentation of the Orthodox Church as part of the breakdown of Ukraine-Russia relations, as part of the fraught issue of autocephaly, and as part of the worsening NATO-Russia relationship, had already begun to contribute to what religious studies expert Nicholas Denisenko, historian, discussed as far back as 2015 as chaos in the church and society and the search for leadership. And in fact, the public and political dimensions of the ecclesiastical and ecclesiological matter of Ukrainian autocephaly require that we train a longer time horizon on what's happening in the war in Ukraine than simply from the start of 2022, or even from the annexation of Crimea in 2014. So, in terms of the geopolitics of religion, as I mentioned, what does geography mean? And for these communities, it means ecclesiological, ecclesiastical communities, and a conception of the world that's organized into territorial, that doesn't fit neatly into territorialized geographies of states. And this is where we go back to the idea of religion as category disruptive. And what we see here is, in terms of these competing religious actors who have their own engagement with politics, they also throw into sharply the transnational dimensions of religion. So it's not only these communities inside Ukraine, it's their connections to their transnational communities outside. And this is very disruptive, either constructive or disruptive and disruptive in terms of what's happening with the war. I would say that the various Orthodox churches, and to a lesser extent, the Greek Catholic Church in Ukraine, have expressed conceptions of the Ukrainian nation that figure either into Kievan or Muscovite state interpretations. And either way, the physical geography of Ukraine is something that they've sacralized in terms of their own language. I want to read a few quotes which I think are instructive in this regard. This is a representative sampling of some of the quotes of the religious community leaders, and this also speaks to the way in which they deploy soft power. They don't have hard power resources. They do have institutional resources that are economic, financial in nature, and they can deploy some of those in terms of economic support, humanitarian relief, etc. But for the most part, the competition amongst religious communities and their engagement with politics has been focused on soft power. And here, let me read a few quotes that are instructive. Archbishop Sviatoslav Shevchuk of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, he draws on theological teachings to condemn the war as falsehood, injustice, sin, and he makes his appeal to intellect. He says, I appeal to intellectual, political, and economic circles, so not just to theological or religious communities, to condemn this Russian war against the Ukrainian nation. He condemns, again, drawing on religious terminology, he condemns as cowardice those who stay quiet, and he says they are collaborators in the crime of the war. Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew has called Russia's invasion of Ukraine an unjust and unholy war, in which Russia, he says, is aiming to dismember the country and annex its eastern part in order to add its own territories to its own territories as it did with Crimea. He rejects Moscow Patriarch Kirill's formulation that Russian soldiers in Ukraine would automatically have their sins forgiven. They would pass directly to the kingdom of God as martyrs, as incompatible with Orthodox theological teachings. Metropolitan Epiphanius, the head of the Autocephalous Orthodox Church of Ukraine, also uses religious language and teachings to condemn the war, he says, as an act of evil, invoking the words of St. John Chrysostom to inspire Ukrainians not to fear death in the face of the invasion. And of course, for his part, Moscow Patriarch Kirill has used theology to characterize the war in Ukraine as a battle between the decadent, a-religious forces of the West against the religious morality and religious authenticity of Moscow's interpretation of Eastern Christianity. He's blessed the war as sacrifice in the course of military duty that washes away all sins. Now, the use of theology as a soft power tool has made its way into the information networks. Information and disinformation networks. And again, I'm happy in discussion to elaborate on that. But I think it's very, very important to recognize that in terms of this geopolitics of religion, and in particular when it concerns what's happening within the Orthodox space, but also between the Eastern Orthodox churches and the Greek Catholic Church, that we see this theological language making its way out onto blog sites, on other web platforms, also in newspapers and through television stations, through radio stations, that are oftentimes funded by state actors, and certainly by the Kremlin and Kremlin oligarchs, but not limited to them. And so I think one of the things that the geopolitics of religion teaches us is to look at the way in which sharp power and information networks are deployed both by states and religious communities for their own particular objectives. And that's where in these information networks with regard to the geopolitics of religion, we see language such as schismatic Constantinople appearing regularly to condemn not only Constantinople from Moscow, but also we see that language being used in terms of intimidation of other Orthodox churches. I'll stop here. I want to say, just by way of conclusion, two simple points. First of all, the need for the continuing conversation, interdisciplinary research and cross-disciplinary conversation that brings together religious actors, religious scholars of religion, historians, political scientists, sociologists, in a conversation about trying to understand this religion geopolitics nexus. This is an existential issue. It's a fascinating intellectual issue, but it's an existential issue. And it affects, in terms of the vision and the mission of the Economos lecture, it affects people around the world, but it affects religious communities in the United States of America, and play a role in discussions, and hopefully civil discussions, that allow for contesting and competing positions about how to address the war in Ukraine. And the war in Ukraine is simply one of the ugliest expressions of the fallenness of all our humanity, because the war in Ukraine is not the only war in this world. And one of the things that's happened with the war, understandably, the focus on attention in the war in Ukraine has been enormous, but there are other places around the world where the kinds of grotesque loss of human life and the deployment of religion, either by states or religious communities, for purposes of controlling ideational and physical geography, is only contributing to the kind of death and destruction that unfortunately we see every day in terms of the war in Ukraine. So thank you for your attention and your patience.